you very much.
Yeah.
Everybody can feel free to speak up today. I'm hoping it'll be a little bit more interactive because we got to talk about the movie. So I have plenty to say about that. Let me just make sure I'm recording. I am. Okay, there we go. All right. Well, it is 9 a.m. Welcome, everybody who's watching live. And for those of you who'll be watching a little bit later, let's see. So today, what we're going to do, quick little housekeeping here about the video intro. I've seen a lot of really good ones so far already. I've gone through and I will update your grades as I watch them. So you will notice that your grade gets posted as I watch. And like I said before, for the intro video, that is complete or incomplete. So if you uploaded something, you're going to get 25 points right for that one. I'm learning a lot from them. Also, just as a reminder, I like to get those video recordings because it helps me to get introduced to people who I might not have had in class. However, if you would prefer not to have your video shared, that is 100% okay. Just send me a quick little email, or I've also had people put it in the comments when they submit the video on WYO courses. That also works. I will make sure not to include that video with the one that goes out to class. Any questions about that before we move forward? Okay, so what we're going to do today is we will do our movie discussion. We will then talk about supplements and hopefully have enough time to move on to our drug classification systems. So here's some pictures of the movies that I asked everybody to watch. Hopefully you were able to get access to them. 3 movies about doping in sport. I think this is kind of a nice, easy way to get introduced to some of the genre of people using drugs to get better at sports. 3 different, 2 kind of similar types of sport with cycling involved in 2 of them, 1 with running. And it's really interesting to see about the kind of the differences and some of the similarities between these different cases overall. So let's start out with 9.79, and I posted these questions for people to read, and I just want to go through these and kind of fill in these questions as we go. Don't feel like you have to fill this in as you're watching right now. I'm going to post these notes afterwards with my recordings, so don't feel that that's necessary for you. Let me see if I can expand this a little bit. There we go. Nice. All right. So the first one here, and I'm going to ask for a little bit of interaction from people who are watching, because that'll help this go a little bit quicker today. If you don't mind putting your camera on, that would be good too. But once again, that's not required. So for 9.79, hello, Victoria. Good morning. What are some of the upbringing characteristics that you may have felt influenced Ben Johnson's decision to use performance-enhancing drugs? Okay, so did anyone out there watch the 9.79 movie? Jay did, Marissa did. Okay, I'm gonna have you guys kind of lead the discussion here. If anybody else who's watching live watch 9.79, feel free to chime in at any point. So, Jay, let's start with you. What are some of the upbringing characteristics that you noticed about Ben Johnson?
What I noticed was that he didn't have a big platform like Carl Lewis did. So I think what kind of drove him to taking performance-enhancing drugs was his pride. You know, he didn't come from a big track club. He was running for a smaller country, and he didn't have anything to lose. I mean, he wanted to win medals, and that's what he did what he had to do to win medals.
Yeah, let's even go back. That's really important for like when he was making the decision. So this is, okay, he's a pretty darn good runner and he's making the decision, yep, I'm going to start using testosterone, HGH to get better. But let's even go back a little bit further. Marissa, would you be able to kind of give a little bit of insight? Let's go back to his childhood. What about his childhood would have led him to that point where he's like, I got nothing to lose?
So he talked about how as a child, he was always like the little one. He was the underdog, and people just looked at him that way. Like they didn't really think about him. They didn't really care about him because he wasn't really a competitor. Like they weren't worried about him.
So that kind of goes back to what Jay was just talking about there, maybe a little bit of pride. I want to talk about one other point here. Did anybody else watch this movie, or was it just Jaden and Marissa? Oh, Lulu, you did. Okay. What about let's bring up something that's in the news right now. What did you think about his SES, Lulu, which is socioeconomic status?
Well, I'm pretty sure he came from a very poor background. He was from Jamaica, and he moved, I think, around the age of 14 or so to live in Canada with his mother. So they didn't really have much, I think, moving to a newer country. But also, he talked about how he was considered like a special child because his mother like prayed over him to save him because there was this disease going around that killed a lot of children. And then he was saved by God. And so he thought he was like this, almighty individual that has this special quality that he's meant to do something special in the world.
So I think those two things combined really, when I was watching this movie, kind of that responsibility of coming to a new country, coming from a poor background. I think that when he started to get good at running, he thought of this as a way that he could provide for his family. Does that kind of make sense? And I'm sure other people who watch other movies, or even people who might be in this situation, being back at home right now, are in this, like, you have to be the person that provides for your family overall. So when it comes to the choice of taking drugs, here he is. He came from a life with very little money. Here's an opportunity to make a lot more money. All he has to do is take this drug that's going to make him better at his sport. If you frame it that way, the decision to take the drug, it's like, well, duh. Why would you not do that? I can make my family happier, put them in a better situation just by doing this. That's a decision I'm going to make. Any comments on that?
Yeah, just one thing. He also talked about how he felt like all of his competitors were doing it. So he's like, why would I even compete with those guys when I can't hang with them regularly and now they're doing drugs? So he's like, if they're going to do it, why shouldn't I?
Yeah, and that's something that I'm sure that other people who maybe watch Stop at Nothing or even the Icarus movie are going to relate to, because that's the theme that goes across. It's basically like, yeah, we hear about people getting busted, but that's a small percentage of the people that are using overall. So cool. Let's move on. Some of the signs and symptoms of drug usage that were mentioned in the movie. I thought this was pretty cool. What did you guys pick out from that? Either Marissa, Lulu, or Jade?
I picked up the braces.
Wasn't that pretty cool editing? So for people who didn't watch the movie, they have this one person talking about how, one of the signs and symptoms of drug use and HGH use is an enlarged jaw, and you can have teeth that get kind of mangled. And then the next scene is they cut to Carl Lewis, who has said he has never taken performance-enhancing drugs. And here's Carl Lewis with braces on. It's this really cool editing that the filmmakers do to not directly say, we think Carl Lewis may have taken some drugs here, but they provide that nice little visual to think, oh boy, that, the chances are he probably took something. So yeah, Jade, that's a really good one. And a large draw. And we'll talk about that. I think that one of the videos that I saw, somebody was interested in HGH. That's one of the downsides of it. You get this big old jaw. Anything else that people picked up on?
They talked about when you're maxing, they said you can usually hit your max every 3 days, but when you're on drugs, you can hit it twice a day, every day, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, max effort. And this brings up a really, really good point, and this is consistent across all the performance-enhancing drugs. So a lot of times we think of, oh my gosh, this performance-enhancing drug is going to make me better at my sport. And we think, okay, and I get really frustrated with this. There's pre-workouts that are labeled as performance-enhancing because they have creatine in them. And I'm going to drink this pre-workout that has creatine in it. And if I drink this one time, this is going to make me better at my sport today. That's not how performance-enhancing drugs work. They work because they enable you to do more work in a training session. And if I do more work in a training session, the adaptations in my body overall, over time, are going to be greater. And then I'm going to be better at my sport down the road, not in one session. Not if I just take, if you have somebody who's running the 400 and they take a creatine pre-workout before they run the 400, are they going to run a PR in that one rep? No, absolutely not. But if they take that consistently for their training, and if they're doing 400 repeats, are able to run 1 second faster on average for their training during their 400s over a month, 2 months, 6 months, their kind of trajectory of training is going to be higher than if they weren't on that. And that's similar with some of these steroid drugs as well. Does it make you stronger in that one session? If I took one testosterone shot before I went to, my basement and lifted weights today, does that mean I'm going to be able to pump out more reps? Maybe one, but is that noticeably different? Probably not. That's the same as if I have a cup of coffee or not. But I'm going to be really sore the next day if I don't have that. If I do take that drug, chances are I can go in there and work out just as hard 2 days later. And over the course of weeks and months, that's going to result in improvement. So that's a theme that's going to be consistent for this entire semester. So keep that in mind. So great point. Let's keep moving on. Describe a moment of the movie that shocked you. What did you see in that movie that was like, whoa? Lulu, let's go to you.
Okay. Well, I think that's to piggyback on the whole wearing braces thing. I think that was mentioned with the almond drug growth hormone was used. And so they were talking about how prior to 1986, you had to get the growth hormone from a cadaver, which I thought was weird and interesting.
Yep, absolutely. So they would actually take cadavers, go into the pituitary gland in people's brains, extract pituitary extract. That was just called pituitary extract. It wasn't called HGH. And then they would refine it to get the human growth hormone out of it. And it's very similar. If we look at a bunch of the other treatments that are out there, like blood doping, the way you used to blood dope was extract your own blood, then spin it down, get those red blood cells, and then re-inject those back a couple months later. It wasn't until the late 90s that they created recombinant or artificial EPO that enabled people to make their own more red blood cells. So it's really interesting. That's a good point. And some of the methods that people use for this are really interesting. When we talk about the history of doping, and somebody had a really good point about that, about how they wanted to learn about the history. Well, the way that the initial people in Greek and Roman times got testosterone was by eating animal testicles, because that's where testosterone is produced. So yeah, going through cadavers is pretty, shocking, but be thankful that this movie was not about Greek and Roman doping. Okay. Any other shocking moments from this movie? Because I have a good one. Jay, what do you got?
I just found it really odd that Carl Lewis's coach had a shrine of him in his house. That blew me away how much stuff he had. But I also thought I was really shocked by how easy it was for athletes to get performance-enhancing drugs from that doctor. Like, it was so simple.
Oh, absolutely. And this is similar to Stop at Nothing as well. I mean, there's this guy, Michael Ferrari, in that movie who's just like, he's an MD. And we see this, like, let's draw another parallel to the opioid epidemic. You just write a prescription, you go to your pharmacy, that pharmacist is taking the doctor's best inclination of this is what the patient needs. It is not my place, even if this person is coming in every other day to get this prescription filled. That's outside of my job description. It's in that MD's kind of scope of practice to make sure that they're prescribing drugs appropriately. And a lot of them don't do it. So the shocking moment to me for people who didn't watch this movie is at the very end. So Ben Johnson comes out and says, yep, I did it. I took performance enhancing drugs, but the drug that I tested positive for, I wasn't taking. And he has this whole conspiracy theory that Carl Lewis spiked. So back in the day when you had to do your drug test, it was same thing, urine sample, but you would drink beer to help you after your race to be able to pee. So instead of just drinking water, they're like, now I'm going to have a couple Miller Lights here. They said that his conspiracy theory is that Carl Lewis spiked his beer, and that's what caused him to test positive. So that, for me, that was like a really shocking moment. So if you even watch just the last 20 minutes of this movie, you will see that really cool part. All right. Evidence of a cover-up for what I just mentioned.
Diuretics
Ah, yeah.
to pretty much dilute their urine, so it's pretty much just like water instead of the steroids.
Right. And you guys will hear about this when Pete and Will, when we play that lecture from them, they have this whole thing. So if anybody's worked in my lab before, we do urine specific gravity, which is a way to relate the concentration of urine to water. Okay. So if it's like 1.03, that means it's more dense and more concentrated than water is. So back in the early days of drug testing, there were no stipulations for how dilute or how concentrated your urine has to be. And Pete and Phil have these stories of having to watch drug tests currently with college athletes, and they have to stay there for like 5 hours with the athlete because right after their race, they drink a bunch of water and then they produce really dilute urine. And now the rules are that your urine has to be a little bit more concentrated, because if it's too dilute, even if there's an illegal substance in there, the amount of it, because it's so dilute, is so little it can't be detected. So the urine has to be concentrated. So here's these guys who are just trying to do their job, waiting for somebody to pee in a way that's able, and that person can't leave the room. So they have to sit there and basically like, you got to go now? What about now? For 5 hours until they produce a sample. It's like, if you ever see Pete or Phil, make sure you give them an elbow bump and say, hey, thanks for sitting in those rooms waiting for those people to pee. Actually, Phil played for Niagara. He's a basketball player. If you ever see Phil around campus, he's like a super tall dude. And he got tested and he had to wait for 5 hours because he was so like amped up after the game that he couldn't pee. Anyways, do you think athletes around Ben Johnson race their entire career clean? We already answered this question. No way. There's a great interview in the movie with a guy, Calvin Johnson, and he's the only person in that movie who I think actually raced clean his entire career. Marissa, did you think the same thing about him?
I did.
Yeah, he seems like a pretty stand-up guy, and he just talks about how he worked and he knew he was never going to beat the people, but he wasn't going to take anything. All right, this goes back to kind of Carl Lewis's coach. If you were an elite level running coach, would this movie change the way that you coach, and if so, how? So after watching this movie where you see these things and you are now a running coach, do you think this would change how you coach?
I would say yes, because like after watching it, I feel like wouldn't you just want your athletes to run clean and based off of like work and talent rather than some drug? Because then it's not really honest. Like you don't really know who's better than the other person if someone's using drugs and the other person's not,
And this gets back to the overarching argument within this entire class. Should we allow athletes to use drugs? Where is that line between, having 9 cups of coffee, using creatine, taking baking soda, and using something that's not necessarily legal? Okay. Mm-hmm. And we'll get into that when we talk about the World Anti-Doping Association and the criteria that they use to determine is a drug illegal or not. Awesome. Great conversation about that one. I'm going to leave this video up until I get the notice from Wild Courses that my course is full. So if you didn't have time to watch it before this lecture, but after this discussion, you want to go back and watch it, I'm going to leave it up for a couple days here. So hopefully you can watch that. All right, moving on to Stop at Nothing. Anybody here in class watch Stop at Nothing? Got a lot of no's. Nobody watched Stop at Nothing. So I'm guessing that the rest of the people watched the Icarus movie. I got some head nods for that one. That is good. Okay, so let's do Icarus first, and then I will give my grand finale with my interpretation of Stop at Nothing. Did anybody watch the 30 for 30 with Lance, though? It was right after The Last Dance. Nathan, did you see that one?
I think I did, but it was a while ago, so it's
it was like 2 months ago.
Oh, okay.
Beginning of the summer. It came right after, as soon as ESPN finished Last Dance with Michael Jordan, they like 2 weeks later they launched the one with Lance.
Yeah, just a brief part, just parts of it.
It's pretty similar. So if you saw one or the other, we can go over that. But let's go on to Icarus, because it seems like people watch this one. All right. So the movie is all about this guy, Brian Fogel. And I just want, if somebody could give a brief summary of what that was. Nathan, would you mind?
Yeah, so it seemed like he was kind of the same as the other guys, but he kind of wanted to get the story out as far as how much doping is in sports, in this case, cycling. And so he tried to, I don't know, he just got a hold of a doctor at a lab in UCLA, and he got a hold of a guy that was in charge of a lab in Moscow. And he was running all these tests for Russian athletes for God knows how long. And he would just fix them like 100% of the, like he would have extra samples, like clean samples of urine that they would swap out. And he had this grand scheme, and he was the mastermind of it.
It's like you couldn't make this stuff up. Like if you were trying to write like a mystery novel, there was no way that you could make something as intricate as what's going on in this movie. So just to give everybody else kind of a little bit of a picture of what's going on, Brian Fogel, his idea is he wants to get it out to people that everybody in professional cycling pretty much is doping. And he goes through, there's this one race he does. If you're familiar with professional cycling or just amateur cycling, actually, there's different categories. So when you start out, you start in category 5, which is the only place I've ever raced, and came in like last. But as you move up the ranks, you get to like category 2 and category 1. Once you're in category 2 or 1, then professional teams will start signing you. It's kind of like the minors for baseball or something like that. And then they can start signing you if you're doing well in category 2 or 1 races. So there's an amateur race that's similar to the Tour de France. Tour de France is for professional teams. There's this amateur race called the Haut Route, and it's basically like this really hard route over in Europe, and they race it every year, but you race as individuals. You don't race as a part of a cycling team per se. So Brian goes out and he's like, okay, I did pretty good in this race last year. I want to go pro. I'm going to dope, and I'm going to record the whole thing. I'm a dude from LA. I'm just going to record the whole thing and show people what it does to me. So that's how he starts out. So he gets in touch with Don Catlin. And Don Catlin is the doc at UCLA who Nathan was talking about. And the interesting thing about Don is he's been this professor for a really long time. He was instrumental in the starting of the U.S. Anti-Doping Association, USADA. And as we talk about the Cream in the Clear with Barry Bonds and some of the other people, the track coach who identified that sample actually mailed it to Don Catlin. So he's been like kind of the centerpiece of American anti-doping for 20 years now. Anyways, so Brian gets in touch with Don and says, hey, Don, I want to dope. Don't worry, I'm not going to do any professional sports or anything. It's totally cool, but I want to do it the right way. I want to do it how all the athletes. Can you help me? And Don starts thinking about it. He's like, okay, yeah, I know kind of the ins and outs of how a person would dope and not get caught and all these things. But then he says, you know what, this would be really bad for my career. It's basically like if I was a scientist and I was taking money for a supplement and then published a paper about how great that supplement was. Here's Don basically talking about how doping is so bad, but in the same time, helping somebody else dope. He didn't want to be associated with that. So he's like, go talk to my boy over in Russia, Dmitry. He's going to help you out. Okay. And it's pretty funny if you watch the movie. The interviewer asked Don, like, how'd you know that, or Grigor is his name. How'd you know that Grigor was going to help us out? He's like, I just knew some things about him, and I knew he would be able to help him. So that's why he decided not to help in the first place and why he sent him to Grigor. Any other comments? Okay, let's keep moving. Nathan, you got into this a little bit. The elaborate protocol Russia and colleagues used to avoid positive tests swapped samples. Victoria, did you watch this movie?
Yeah, I watched this movie and I thought this part was extremely interesting. He's described like an outlet in the wall that was used to place all of the soiled samples in it. The people would take the soiled samples out of it, go across into another building, and they'd replace it with clean ones, and then come back and put it in the same place, and then they would just take the clean samples out. And the way that they found it out was because there were marks on the inside of the bottle where they had ripped the caps right off of it.
That's true. So basically, here's your good guy scientist in the lab, right? And in here, he's got like, okay, here's his bench. And he's got his like urine samples like hanging out there. And here on the outside, in a back alley somewhere, is our bad dude. And he just comes up and reaches through a hole in the wall, and basically they had a guy on the inside too who would like make sure that the Russian samples were right by that like outlet. And then the bad dude would come up, open that little portal, take out those samples, and replace it. Actually, what they would do is they'd take the sample, and what Victoria was saying is, so when you have these urine samples, we're going to watch a video in a couple lectures about how intricate these bottles are. They're supposed to be tamper-proof, right? It's like you close it, and then the only way to get the top off of the urine sample container is to break the top. So you wouldn't be able to close it. However, what Victoria was saying is, after the fact, after they found out that this, something fishy was going on here, they looked at a microscope at the inside of the caps, and it turns out that Russia figured out a way, probably by contacting the manufacturer, to actually remove the caps without breaking them. They would dump out the urine from their athlete that they knew was tainted, that they knew had a lot of HGH or whatever in it, and then they'd fill it up with clean urine. And that's what they would do. And so they had this very elaborate, it was crazy. So, yeah, Nathan.
Well, they had the KGB had a building about across the alleyway from them, and that's where they had the bank of all the clean samples. So then, yeah, they just were, 100 yards away.
Yeah, and I think were the 2016, were those in Russia?
So I think Sochi was 14 and
okay, yeah,
was 16 in Rio de Janeiro, right?
16, and then where was it? 18. So 2014.
Or it went Beijing, then Rio.
2014 was, Sochi. Okay, so they must have just scouted out the location beforehand, and the KGB all flew there and was like, okay, we got this building all locked down. It's just absolutely bonkers to me. Hannah, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I found it so interesting how even like people high up in politics were involved, and still to this day they are denying any kind of involvement in it, even though there was like thousands of documents reviewed and so much evidence against them, but people like Putin are still denying any involvement. I just thought that was crazy how they got away with that, but all the evidence was right there in front of them. So.
Well, I mean, if you think about this is part of a larger picture overall, and the doping that we see here with Lance Armstrong is very different than the doping that we see in the motivations for the systematic doping in different countries. So if you think about Lance Armstrong as an individual person, he is doping. He is doing that because he wants to make a lot of money. That's what he's doing. He wants fame. He wants fortune. He wants notoriety in his sport. If you think of the systematic doping that's happening at countrywide, this is used as an example for, the upper level governmental officials to show the residents of their country how great and how proud they should be of their country. It's like, yeah, you have all these things that you have to worry about. We're oppressing you in all these different ways. You don't have freedom of speech, but look at how great our athletes are. Look at them winning all these gold medals all over the place. Aren't things great? Aren't you willing to put up with a little bit of oppression to see our country represented on such a great stage? So it's very different to think of it that way. And you look at it, so for the leaders of these countries, it's great for them to show how good their athletes are. but it's really bad for them to show, oh, we're doing this in a way that's illegal.
Yeah. Well, they also mentioned, they showed like a figure, and Putin at the time, right before that specific period in time when there was so much doping going on behind the scenes, he was very unpopular. Like, a lot of people didn't want to vote for him. And then as soon as like all the Olympic athletes started winning medals, his popularity increased. It spiked like dramatically. So yeah, it's just crazy.
Yeah. So, it's almost like the individual choice for Ben Johnson is like the choice for these governmental leaders. Okay. If we do this thing, if we make this decision to put this program in place, we're going to stay in office and we'll keep, being able to do this. If we don't do this, well, people are going to be upset. Nathan?
Yeah.
Going off of what she just said about the graph, he was so confident after they won all those medals that he just started a war with Ukraine.
Yeah.
Like right after those Olympic Games, he just was so aggressive because he was so confident.
Right, because he's like, the people trust me, my popularity is high. I'm going to do something that I know they probably wouldn't like under other circumstances, but they're so distracted by us winning all those medals that they probably won't even care.
Yeah.
It's just like, hey, look over there. I'm going to do this thing. I wonder if we could think about that in terms of our national politics here. Maybe. I'll leave that up to you guys. Let's move on. Given the evidence in the film, do you think there's any way to reduce doping in sport? This is a really hard question. Think about how intricate. What could the governing bodies have done to stop this?
I don't know if the governing bodies can necessarily, I mean, I haven't really considered that component, but I don't know if you watch competitive swimming, but Yulia Efimova is one of Russia's star swimmers. She's like one of the world champs in the breaststroke events. And I think it was at Rio in 2016, she was racing Lily King from the USA. And after Lily King beat her, she like shook her finger and was like, no, see, I beat you and I did it fairly, because she knew Yulia was like using stuff. And then there was another incident where Sun Yang, I'm not sure if you know who he is, but
Yeah.
he's another huge figure in swimming, and he competed at the world champs, even though everyone knew that he had been tested, but his results had somehow been lost or tampered with. And so he wasn't proven guilty for doping. And he still went on to win medals at the world champs. And swimmers like from Britain and Australia refused to get on the podium with him, and he was booed and stuff. So I think, honestly, if there's proof and evidence that people have been doping, just by not showing your support and protesting against it will somehow make a difference. Because that was huge. When I was watching that, I was shocked. I was like, good for them. They are taking a stand against, doping and showing that it's not okay, and, you shouldn't get away with it because it's not fair.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's basically if the athletes are the ones driving it, that could be, a way to kind of change the norms. If it's because the norm right now is, or has been since the 90s, do whatever you can to get ahead. But if it becomes this way, as it seems to be going in swimming, if testing gets better and more people are getting, positive tests, and they kind of get shunned from the sport overall, that might be a way to kind of change the thought process of that athlete who's making the decision to either dope or not. Because right now, has anybody taken like economics? Have you guys done any of that? I know sometimes people take that. There's something called game theory out there, and or the prisoner's dilemma. Have you guys heard of that before? Hunter, have you heard of that? A little bit. Basically, it's this. The prisoner's dilemma has to do with like you and your buddy both get arrested, and what's the decision making process of you ratting out your friend, and it's all based on what the outcomes are going to be. Right now, the downside of doping, first of all, the chances of getting caught are very, very low. And second, if you do get caught, the punishments are like a 6-month ban, a 1-year ban, something like that. And so athletes are thinking, well, even if I get caught, I'll still be able to come back and be good at my sport a little bit later. But if what Hannah's saying, if that person is kind of like, persona non grata after they come back, even that could be a way that person, before they make that decision, might say, you know what? The risks of taking this and getting caught are actually higher than they were before. So I'm not going to do that. Okay. What happened to the evidence after Brian Fogel went to the IOC? Oh, this was pretty cool. This was really cool. So Brian and Grigor go to the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, and say, hey, here's all this evidence of Russian doping at the Olympics, and we want you to do something about this. Here's all these pages of documents. Do you guys remember what happened? What happened to that?
Didn't they kind of shrug it off?
Yeah, they just ignored it. So the IOC, they were so prideful. They're like, nah, there's no way. Oh, you're telling us this story about this lab and they have this pass-through and blah, 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 and you have this video evidence and everything. They're like, there's no way that could happen. And nothing happened because of it. There was an article in the New York Times, and that was about the extent of it. IOC.
Did the New York Times be?
Oh, we lost you, Nathan. Hopefully he'll come back in a minute. So the IOC shrugged it off. All right, last two here. What was the most shocking moment of the film? Hey, Tristan, did you watch this one?
Yeah, I did. For me, there was a couple I thought, let's see. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. I thought that when the lengths that they went to protect him for fear of being silenced, quote unquote, when they flew him to Los Angeles and things like that. And then it mentioned in the beginning, the Russian doctor, I don't know how to say his last name, like he would mention like his mother would inject him because, you couldn't afford certain amounts of or training or doping if you were, Olympic level athletes or something like that in Russia, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah. So, the Russian government actually sent people after this doctor to probably try to silence him once they knew he had left the country. And that is absolutely wild. And you see this, this is not a bridge too far for Russian government at all. I mean, we just saw this recently in the news with somebody who's a critic of Vladimir Putin was just poisoned, and basically Russia's like, no way, he wasn't poisoned, and he had to get on an emergency flight to Germany in order to get treated at a hospital, because if he had stayed in Russia, they probably wouldn't have been able to treat him, which is, so not too shocking to see something like this. Relate the Russian government's response to our current news environment. I just did that. And how does this influence your idea of truth? This is a real loaded question, and anybody can answer this. Even if you didn't watch the movie, you've kind of gotten the gist of this overall. But how does this kind of, display or wild disregard for the rules make you guys think about truth in general? It's a very loaded question. Hunter, you got any thoughts on that one?
I'm not entirely sure. I'm kind of going back and forth on this one. It makes me almost want to question everybody a little bit extra and not really believe in the truth as much. Interesting enough, I just listened to a podcast on the KGB and just how involved they are across the entire world in putting out false truths, and found that super interesting.
Yeah, it makes it very hard. The entire kind of modus operandi of the KGB and, different government entities around the world. I don't want to just center this on Russia. That's what this story was about. But for us to think that's the only government agency that's doing this, or any agency maybe not even associated with the government, we see this in our current news environment. The whole thought process is not necessarily, I want people to believe this thing. It's just that I want to flood the newscape with so much garbage that when an actual reputable source comes out with a story, people are too overloaded and too in disbelief to even think about that as truth. So you have places like InfoWars, in our current news, putting out whatever garbage conspiracy theory they can think up with. They got, Pizzagate for, government and that kind of stuff. And the whole thought process there is we'll make people, we'll show people that news is coming out with these things. And then when the New York Times or an actual reputable news agency comes out with a story, they're like, well, that could be just as bad as this, random person over here who's just making up a story based on one photo they found. And that's the whole thought process behind a lot of these, these initiatives by governmental agencies, for sure. And doping is one way that they kind of get into that kind of landscape overall. Before we move on, any last comments from anybody on any of these, either of the movies, comments you want to make about it, things they made you think about, either your participation in sport or otherwise?
I just thought one thing that was kind of funny, I just got a chuckle at when Radchikov was at Brian's house in LA and he was like diluting the samples or concentrating them. He was doing it and he gives him like this eerie, creepy look and he's like, "We are mafia. This is mafia." And he was just so casual about it though.
Absolutely. There's another good podcast out there. I think it's Hidden Brain, if anybody's ever listened to that, with Shankar Vedantam. Really cool podcast that's out there. And they talk about the progression of law breaking. And basically like who here, let's do a show of hands, who's, gone to the grocery store and maybe had a grape from the produce aisle. Totally. I've done that. And basically what this whole thought process is like, if you do something that's like an innocuous rule breaking, well, if you did that and then later in the day, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to park in a no parking zone. All right. And then later in the day, it's like, oh, you see a person drop $1 and you're like, yoink, that's my $1 now. There's this progression of, as you normalize these different kind of steps of law breaking, the next one gets easier. So from you to go from eating a grape to parking in a no parking is the same amount of kind of moral dilemma that a person who's already doing some pretty bad stuff just to go to the next level of that. So it's not harder for them to go from doping to helping another person dope. For them, that decision is just as easy as you choosing to go from eating a grape to parking in a no parking zone. It's a very, very small uptick versus a person who wouldn't eat the grape in the first place would think, how could I help somebody else dope? For the people who are actually making that decision, it's way, way easier. And that's what I think Nathan's talking about there. You hear them talking about being mafia and how anyone of like, imagine being over at your friend's house and being on a sports team. Hannah, you could think about this being on the swimming team. Imagine if you're one of your teammates and you just see them come out of the bathroom. They're like, ha ha ha, look at this. I'm going to dilute my urine sample. If you saw that, you'd be like, oh my God, that is crazy. But for these people who do that every day, it's normalized. It's part of their normal participation in sport.
Well, I was also just going to add to that. I think there was one point in the movie where Gregor says, when I was an athlete, my mother injected me with steroids and stuff. And so I grew up, kind of thinking that was okay because everyone else was doing it. So why can't I do it? Or else I'm never going to be as good as them. So it's
yeah.
Where do you draw that line? I mean, I know, obviously I don't take anything, but my parents say to me, like, you should be taking something, like your body's going through a lot every day, like you've got to be on some kind of like something to help you, and yeah, it's just a matter of, and we have to talk to our nutritionist and our trainer and tell them exactly what's in everything we take, whether it's birth control or like just a multivitamin. We have to let them know everything, because one little like tiny ingredient could set it off. Like something crazy like poppy seeds, you can't have too many of them or else you'll fail the drug test. It's crazy.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. The case I always like to bring up is Will Greer. If anybody's a college football or a pro football fan, Will Greer was a quarterback. He eventually finished his career at West Virginia, but started at Florida. And he was banned for a year because, well, in the offseason, he put on 40 pounds by taking a supplement that he bought at GNC. Well, it turns out they tested that supplement after the fact, and we're going to talk about this today. And that supplement that was available at GNC had human growth hormone concentrate in it. So he claims that he did not know that at the time, but at the same thing, he was punished because of it. Because just like Hannah said, as an athlete in college sports and pro sports, you are responsible for what goes into your body, even if you don't know that you're taking something illegal. Any last comments? Jay, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I've watched both of the movies. I watched Icarus over quarantine, and then I just watched the 979. And I just think that from both of those, why haven't we changed the way that we test athletes?
We have. We have changed the way. It's gotten a lot more complex, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more as well. But it used to be very simple. There were 2 or 3 things they were looking for in samples. They were looking for testosterone, human growth hormone, and maybe some stimulants like cocaine. Those were like the main things that athletes were using at the time. But now we have this world, and the Balco scandal is a great example of this, and that's all related to Victor Conti, Barry Bonds, and some other track athletes in the California area. But it's a great example. So now we have these chemists who know they can make a lot of money by making things that turn into an illegal drug once they get into your body. And the metabolites of that are not necessarily detectable. So what they are doing is they're chemically engineering something that has the same effect as human growth hormone, but when you test the urine sample, will not pop positive for human growth hormone. So the way that we've changed is not identifiable because we take the same sample. We still take a urine sample. But the things that have changed between 1986 and 2020 are that the battery of tests that are involved are a lot greater. The other big change that has come along, and this happened in the early 2000s, is they basically said, okay, when we get your sample, we're going to split that sample into 2. We're going to test one of them now, and we're going to put one of them in the freezer. And it's the same freezers we have upstairs in Corbett right here, the minus 80-degree freezers. And what those do is they basically freeze the metabolites, so hopefully nothing will break down in that sample. And the reason that they do that is because all of the people who are testing for drug use in sport are basically thinking, I know all of the rule breakers out there are one step ahead of me. They're doing something right now to dope their athletes because they know that I won't catch that. So we know eventually we'll figure that out, but it'll probably be after this person has stopped doing the sport. But we want to hold on to their sample so that once we discover what that metabolite is, we can actually test for that. Because there's more monetary benefit for people discovering new chemicals that work versus being able to find those ahead of time. So yeah, it would be great if we figured out a better way to do it. So there are grants available. If you are interested after this class and want to get more into this, actually the U.S. Anti-Doping Association does have grants available for students who want to kind of think about this work. So think about that over the course of this semester. Well, this conversation was too good. We're at 9:48 right now, 2 minutes before class. I'm not going to try and squeeze in any of our DNA barcoding or anything about supplements. We will save that for Friday. I really appreciate people for turning on their cameras and having a conversation today. I think that makes class a lot better. I'm hoping that the people who I know people's schedules are really funky right now, and people have emailed me to say, hey, I'm not going to be able to make class this semester. But even if you're able to just pop in one day a week for the live lectures, I really appreciate it. It makes it better for me. I know you guys would prefer to be in class. I would prefer to be in class so we could have these conversations. So I want to make this an environment, even if it's digital, that people feel comfortable kind of sharing and having a discussion. So I really, really thank everybody for doing that today. This will be posted a little bit later. Remember, your intro videos are due by the midnight tonight. So if you haven't done that yet, get that done. You'll start off with a nice 100% grade going into the first homework or first quiz. So let's get that done. Any other questions? All right, guys. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing and I will end the meeting. See you on Friday.